Okay, good morning or good evening, students, depending on kind of when you're listening to this lecture. This is going to focus on the kind of last part of Chapter 19. Well, not really quite the last part of Chapter 19, because the very, very, very last part is talking about all the specific blood vessels, and we're leaving that for lab. But we're going to focus on these two sections right here, kind of looking at how blood flows through our tissues and through our capillaries. So we're going to start with talking about perfusion. It's a term that comes up a lot in the healthcare field and kind of nursing school and all of that. And the word perfusion is specifically talking about the movement of our blood, movement of our fluids through all of our specific organs and body tissues. So now coming out of the blood vessels themselves and kind of moving through the body's tissues. And of course, this is how we get oxygen and nutrients out to those tissues. It's how we get waste away from those tissues and out of those tissues. It's how gas exchange occurs in our lungs, the exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen. It's how your GI tract absorbs the nutrients from the food that we eat. It's how your kidneys make urine to help us regulate our blood volume and electrolyte volume and get rid of waste products. And your body is really quite excellent at kind of matching and controlling the amount of flow and the rate of the blood flow into each of these organs and tissues to kind of match the function of that tissue. And your body makes all these little minute adjustments all the live long day to make sure that they're getting adequate tissue perfusion. Of course, the problem with not adequate tissue perfusion is then and that's why, again, maintaining blood pressure is so important, has to be high enough that we get blood out to all the blood vessels and out to all the organs and the tissues that need the oxygen and nutrients, but not so high that we kind of bust through them. If an organ does not receive adequate perfusion, then it's not getting enough blood, which means not getting enough oxygen and nutrients, and of course the resulting part is potentially cell death for that particular area, and that's not something that we want to see happen. So there are really kind of both external factors and internal factors that regulate blood flow. A lot of the external factors, what we call extrinsic controls, are things that we've already really talked about. We've talked about how the sympathetic nervous system, will dilate blood vessels leading to skeletal muscles in a fight or flight situation, and decrease the size of the blood vessels leading to the digestive tract in a fight or flight situation. And all of the hormones that we've talked about, the aldosterone and ADH and angiotensin, ANP, all of these hormones act on the smooth muscle in the arterioles, in the walls, and it really is about getting the blood flow to the areas that need it the most, and kind of directing it away from the areas that need it the least. What we haven't yet discussed are the intrinsic controls of blood flow, what we call autoregulation, literally self-regulating, where the blood vessels themselves can control just locally, just their own little patch of grass, as it were, their own blood flow to meet whether they're an active tissue or a non-active tissue, whatever their requirements are at that moment in time. The blood vessels themselves can kind of self-regulate, and they do so by, again, changing the diameter of those arterioles that feed into the specific capillaries for that specific organ. So this is a really good example here. We have blood flow at rest versus blood flow in a person during exercise. The first thing I want you guys to notice is just look at the total blood flow. If you look at the blood flow at rest, you'll see it's just a little under 6,000 milliliters a minute. But if you look at the total blood flow during an exercise period, you see it's gone up nearly 3 times, almost 3 times, nearly 18,000 now. In part, that's because your heart is pumping faster, and if your heart is pumping faster, you have greater cardiac output, and so you have this kind of greater amount of blood flow. I also want you to look at your brain. If you look at the blood flow at the brain, you'll see it's pretty much unchanged between at rest and when you're active. That's because the brain is a very metabolically active tissue pretty much all of the time, because, well, it's your brain. Look at your heart. You'll see your heart at rest, pretty good blood flow, but when you're active, your heart's getting much greater blood flow. Let's look at the kidneys. You'll see at rest, a good portion of your blood flow is actually going to your kidneys and to your digestive system. So it's taking care of the kind of digestion processes, and the kidneys are actually at rest, constantly making urine. They decrease a little bit, but still quite a good blood flow out to those areas. But the biggest change is here in the skeletal muscles and the skin, particularly here in the skeletal muscles. You'll see about 12,000 milliliters a minute to the skeletal muscles at rest, but look when you're active. Look how much more blood goes to your skeletal muscles when your skeletal muscles are active. So your body is making changes in order to accommodate kind of what level of activity you happen to be at. So there are kind of two types of autoregulation that kind of focus on different things. There's what we call metabolic controls that are really more concerned with keeping your perfusion and kind of matching your perfusion to whether the tissue is active or not. The myogenic, myo means muscle, are more about keeping perfusion to the specific organ at a relatively constant level, despite kind of external changes, external at least to the specific organ, changes in the blood pressure. And both of these kind of play a role, and they kind of work hand in hand together to kind of result in the kind of final response. Okay, so let's look at the metabolic controls first. So when you have an active tissue, you're using up your oxygen, so your levels of oxygen become less. Your levels of carbon dioxide and all these different metabolites that are a result from all these biochemical reactions that take place during and in the body, especially when the body is active, things like prostaglandins, hydrogen ions, adenosine nucleotides, all these kind of various metabolites, their levels will increase because they're kind of waste products, right? And so all of these things indicate an active tissue. So the response, okay, we have an active tissue, we need more blood flow. So the arterioles dilate, the sphincter muscles leading into the capillaries relax, and so rather than kind of shunting through the thoroughfare channel, it percolates out to the whole capillary. The endothelial cells lining the blood vessels in that area secrete nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is a vasodilator, so the blood vessels get bigger, and the result is what we call hyperemia, which is basically an increased perfusion to that particularly active tissue. So here's our skeletal muscle, for instance. We're exercising. You'll see that our levels of oxygen decline, levels of carbon dioxide and all these other metabolites like hydrogen ions increase. That indicates an active tissue. And so then the local arterioles will vasodilate, and we get an increased blood flow to the active tissue. Now, the myogenic controls are about kind of regulating perfusion despite changes in the mean arterial pressure in the body kind of as a whole. That keeps perfusion to each of these kind of local organs where it should be without causing damage to the tissues. Now, the smooth muscle in the walls of the blood vessels have this very interesting response to when they are stretched. When smooth muscle is stretched, its response is to contract. And so that's what happens. When mean arterial pressure goes up, the muscle in the walls of those local blood vessels get stretched more than kind of quote-unquote normal. Smooth muscle's response is to contract and constrict, and then that decreases the blood flow to the tissue. And so say you have hypertension, for some reason. Maybe you're stressed out. Well, an increased blood pressure means an increased blood flow overall, but we don't want blood flow to kind of overwhelm a tissue, and so that tissue says, okay, we're going to make the tube leading to us a little bit smaller in order to kind of compensate for the higher blood pressure and the higher flow. Now, the exact opposite happens when you have low mean arterial pressure. Now, the smooth muscle in the walls gets less stretched, and so smooth muscle's response then is to dilate. So if you have hypotension for some reason, blood flow throughout your body will be less, and so the local arterioles will dilate and get bigger in order to compensate for the lower pressure and thus the lower blood flow. That keeps blood flow to their kind of just local area where it should be and where it needs it to be. So this is a nice little kind of summary figure. If you look at the extrinsic controls, again, neural, sympathetic, and all the hormonal controls, they're of course maintaining the arterial pressure, excuse me, and kind of doing this directing of blood flow to kind of where it needs to go in the body as a whole. Now, the intrinsic autoregulatory controls, the metabolic controls, myogenic controls are about matching. The metabolic controls are about matching kind of the activity of the tissue to the blood flow that it gets, and these myogenic controls are about keeping blood flow relatively constant despite kind of external forces, as it were. So this is a nice little summary figure for you. Now, all of those things that I just discussed are really short term. Now, if you had chronically low tissue perfusion, if a tissue was consistently not getting enough blood and thus not getting enough oxygen and nutrients, that's a problem, right? You want good perfusion to the organs of your body. Your body can actually make new blood vessels. It's a process called angiogenesis. You make new blood vessels. The kind of blood vessels that are already there will get bigger, and your body can kind of compensate that way. It occurs in your heart if one of your arteries of the heart get blocked. Not necessarily those two big coronary arteries, but if something like the circumflex artery had a blockage, then your heart could make a new blood vessel to kind of go around, and it's a detour basically to kind of get past the blockage. Now, if one of your two coronary arteries was occluded or blocked, then you would need a bypass, because those are really kind of the main sources of blood for your heart, and even angiogenesis can't kind of compensate for that. Angiogenesis is also quite common in people who move to high altitude areas. So say, for instance, you were living along the coast and all of a sudden you moved to Colorado. I had some friends that did that. When you live in a higher altitude, there's kind of less available oxygen in the atmosphere, and so your body takes in less oxygen just compared to if you were living closer to sea level. And so your body's response is to make new blood vessels and bigger and more blood vessels to kind of compensate for that lower atmospheric oxygen. So your body is really quite good at maintaining tissue perfusion. If we look at kind of the speed at which the blood is flowing through these tissues, you'll see that it's actually related to the total cross-sectional area of the blood vessels. So not necessarily the total kind of we're not talking strictly about diameter here, we're talking about kind of total area of each type of blood vessel. And you'll see the aorta and the vena cava, since we only have one aorta really, and we have just the two vena cava. There's not really a lot of total area. As we get into more the elastic arteries and the muscular arteries, and then down to those arterioles, and then finally the capillaries, we have literally millions upon millions of them. The total kind of area that they encompass is quite large, and that thus means the flow of blood through those capillaries is kind of much slower than it would be perhaps if we were a blood cell moving through the vena cava or through the aorta. This is a good thing, right? If you are just kind of flying through and just streaming through a capillary very, very rapidly, the blood, then there's not really any time for exchange to take place. There's no time for the blood to drop off oxygen and pick up carbon dioxide, or drop off nutrients and pick up waste products. If it's on the feeder, if it's on the expressway, right? It has to go a little slower so that there's time for those exchange processes to take place. In terms of how stuff gets in and out of capillaries, if we're talking about molecular stuff, solutes really, we're going to talk about how fluid flows in a separate lecture here. But if we're talking about kind of the solute components of this, it's all about diffusion, right? Capillaries are very permeable. They've got the little fenestrations, the little pores. They might have these little clefts between cells. And so it's really, really, really about diffusion down our concentration gradients, with rare exception. So anything that's lipid soluble can diffuse directly through the membrane of the cells, because the cells themselves, their membranes are lipid soluble. If it's water soluble, it has to then either move through one of these clefts or move through these fenestrations. And if you have something quite large, then you might actually not just use just kind of more passive diffusion, but maybe even some active transport via a little vesicle, like an endocytosis, exocytosis process. So that's how solutes kind of move into and out of capillaries, mostly through diffusion, but then maybe some large things will use a little bit of active transport. Now, the fluid itself is a slightly different process. It's still that we're going to discuss here in just a second. It's a process that we call bulk flow, and that's what the next lecture will focus on.